Okay, so what I do want to preface this talk with is it's not a talk about the patterns of deforestation, which we're going to hear more from Bob this afternoon, nor is it a talk about the drivers of deforestation. What I really want to talk about today are really, you know, the kind of the consequences to fragmentation from an ecological, biological sort of standpoint, and looking at how, you know, forests might change over time as related to sort of mostly anthropogenic habitats. And so, you know, how do we study the effects of habitat fragmentation? Well, habitat fragmentation studies have been ongoing now for about 40, even 50 years. And there have been a lot of different approaches to studying fragmentation. One of them is people have taken advantage of natural fragments. This is a picture that was taken in the Noel area in Bolivia, where you get, you know, because of soil, because of fire, you get fragments that are natural. They're not human caused fragments, and they exist within a matrix of savanna or other kinds of habitat. There are, you know, anthropogenic fragments like this shot taken from Costa Rica, where you get small patches of fragments that people study. And then there are experimental fragments, which we're going to talk a little bit later on in this talk about studies that have been done with experimental fragments that have been created in otherwise a forested landscape. When a lot of these studies started taking place, of course, was in the 70s, and when we really began to notice that forest fragments were being created all over the world and that they have potential consequences for all kinds of processes, ecological, biological, social processes, and so forth. And really the basis of a lot of the early theory that went into fragmentation studies could really be traced back to MacArthur and Wilson's theory of island biogeography, which was the basic premise that the number of species that occur on an island really represented this balance between species that arrive to the island and species that might go extinct from the island for a variety of different reasons. And when the rates are equal, essentially, then the number of species is in equilibrium. And it was really viewed as sort of this dynamic equilibrium of species arriving, species departing, in essence, through extinction or whatnot. And it's important to remember that the equilibrium model of island biogeography theory, when it was developed, was really about islands in the sea. You know, so really inhospitable and very different kind of surrounding to the forests that exist. And so the basis, again, was this equilibrium between immigration and extinction. And so you could have, the P represents some kind of regional pool of species, and each island is going to have some number of species S. And so the rate of immigration for each new species that could potentially arriving at an island that's beginning to fill up with species as we move along the axis here begins to decline. So the chances get lower and lower as you get more species adding into the system. This is the arrival of a new immigrant. Whereas as you have more species on the island, the chances of any one of them going extinct actually then begins to increase. And so in the model then, this number of species that are present on an island is this where the immigration and extinction rates essentially cross each other. And so then at that point, this equilibrium number of species for any given island of any given size, again, I just want to remind you, it's dynamic. It changes over. It's not supposed to be stable in time. Okay, the number of species is theoretically stable in time, but who those species are change over time on a particular island. So that's sort of the basic premise. And so when you think about, okay, now starting to vary the model a little bit, there's a couple of really important assumptions about the model. And that is that the number of individuals that you have on an island, regardless of what species you have, is proportional to the size of the island. So as you get bigger islands, you'll have more individuals of any given species on the island. And that the probability of extinction decreases with increasing population size. Now this is a really important thing in basically conservation biology. It's one of the paradigms, is that small populations, few individuals in a population, make them much more susceptible to extinction, and largely through these sorts of chance events that might happen. You know, a really bad hurricane whips through, and if you have fewer individuals than another species, well, the chance that you're going to lose everybody is greater. Or through, well, I'll talk about some of the other kinds of stochastic events in just a couple of minutes. But so these are two really big assumptions. And so the idea is that if you have larger islands, the extinction rate on those larger islands is going to be lower because population sizes are higher. So the chance of any individual species going extinct is lower. So on larger islands, you have more species than you do on smaller islands. Now, what I want to point out is when this theory was being developed and being applied in the early 1980s, people were testing it in forest fragments on the mainland, as well as on islands. And so it quickly became adopted by kind of this growing field of conservation biology to be incorporated into our ideas of how do you design reserves? How do you design parks? And so the kind of the conventional wisdom that would come from something like this was, well, larger parks are better than smaller parks because the rate or possibility of extinction will be lower. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about as we go on. But when you see this islands, think in your head, people are thinking reserves. People are thinking protected areas as this theory was being developed. And so from the immigration point, so the last one is really sort of an area effect. This is kind of an isolation effect. And isolation theoretically is affecting the immigration rates. So if you're closer to some sort of source population, then your chance of immigration is actually going to be higher. You know, just by chance alone, you're throwing darts at a dartboard. If you're closer to that dartboard, you're going to hit it. Well, at least I will. Than if I'm farther away. Okay, so that's just generally, that's kind of almost like a random process here. So near islands will hold more species on average than farther islands. Okay. And so the hypothetical number of species then on an island or reserve is going to be related to its size and to its isolation. So larger islands relative to small islands should have more species, and those that are less isolated should have the most number of species. Okay, so that sort of sets the theoretical framework on which a lot of studies then went out in the 1980s and sort of tested in all kinds of different environments. And that theory led to this sort of the quote-unquote species area relationship. That is, as the areas get larger, you have a greater number of species, and that those islands that are closer will have relatively more species for any given area than those islands that are far away. And this data set actually came from islands out in the ocean and was published about 30 years ago. Okay, well, it's obviously not as simple as all that. I'm sure everybody recognizes that. And that there are other factors which, of course, are really important in influencing the number of species that can be maintained in any sort of given area size. And one of the very early things that was recognized was this, you know, as islands get bigger and bigger, well, the kinds of habitats they may include are going to change over time. And so, for example, in a really small forest island in the middle of the Amazon, you might not have one of these natural solidaros or mammal licks in this case, where there's different kinds of soil and you get all kinds of big mammals and birds that come in to sort of feed on the soil. Well, in a really small island or forest patch, you might not have that kind of habitat present, which might affect basically the species then that you find in that forest fragment or island. So the idea is that as you increase in island size or fragment size, you almost undoubtedly are increasing in the kinds of habitats that it contains, whether there's bamboo forest patches, whether there's forest streams, whether there's a palm hardwood swamp. You know, those kinds of different kinds of habitats that exist within the forest are going to change, probably as a function of its size. And whether or not that's important to predict the number of species in a forest patch will depend a lot on who those species are and how sensitive they are to different kinds of habitats. In other words, in this thing, both of these, you end up increasing species as you get to larger sizes in these cartoons. But in this case, it matters because the species that you're increasing represent sort of specialist species that divide themselves out by particular habitats. Where in this case, you have a bunch of generalist species, and it doesn't matter that you have 3 different habitats, you can find them in all kinds of habitats. So habitat diversity may be a key factor to consider when you look at the patterns of relationships between the number of species and the size of the forest or the distance from the forest. So for example, in this study from mammals of Southeast Australia, what we have, I can use my mouse here as a pointer. What we have is a relationship where as you increase the area of these fragments in Southeast Australia, you actually also increase the habitat diversity. So there are more habitats and larger patches of these forests. You also find this relationship between area and the number of species or species diversity. And when I say species diversity, that may mean different things to different people. I usually tend to use it in the sense of the number of species or species richness. And I say those two almost interchangeably. It might also be the kind of Shannon-Wiener diversity index that some of you might be familiar with. Whatever, it usually is pretty well correlated with the number of different species. So in this case, with species diversity, you also get an increase with area. But when you correct this relationship for habitat diversity, it turns out that it's the number of habitats that are predicting the increased mammal species richness rather than area. The habitat diversity was more important in this case than area in building that relationship between the number of species. So habitat diversity may be a really kind of key component of the relationship that you see. So with that sort of really simple background, let's look at some of the empirical data that talk about the habitat fragmentation and the biological consequences. So again, you know, this is the pattern. We're going from, you know, the mass Amazon forest, let's put it this way, to some sort of less amount of Amazon forest. And when you have fragmentation, what's happening? Here are essentially the patterns. First of all, very importantly, you get a loss of area. Now, I've done a lot of work, or some work, in the Atlantic forest of Brazil. The Atlantic forest of Brazil, you know, occurs all the way from sort of up, well, even north of Bahia down through São Paulo state into Paraná. And we think that we've lost probably more than 90% of the original Atlantic forest. So if that maps on completely to sort of number of individuals, that means we've lost 90% of the individuals in that forest. Yet when you look at birds, actually, we've had almost no extinction of bird species in the Atlantic forest to date, which is a whole other topic. But anyways, so first of all, it's important to remember there is loss of habitat directly. And then the spatial configuration of what remains has most likely been changed, unless there's like this complete sort of wave of deforestation where you lose everything and you're going kind of pushing it along in the frontier. You also get a change in the number of habitat patches, the size of those patches, the isolation of those remaining patches. Some might be more isolated than others. They're surrounded by different kinds of habitat. And as we'll talk a little bit about later, those patches that remain become often degraded or deteriorate, or habitat quality goes down, and that's often related to what we call edge effects, which we'll talk about in just a little bit as well. And so the fragmentation effects are, again, the habitat alteration, the loss, the size distribution, its isolation, the proportion of habitat that is close to other kinds of habitat, whether it be pasture or agroforestry or urban or whatevers, and those create different kinds of edge conditions. The area effects, the size affects the number of individuals that are in that fragment or that even that population, and that affects their susceptibility to sort of chance events and extinction or reproduction. Species effects, you might lose. It's not just usually a random loss of species. There are certain species that are more susceptible to fragmentation than others. Some of those might be the top predators, like jaguars. Some of them might be specialist species that rely, for example, on that little pig wallow that might not be there in the fragment when it gets isolated. The isolation effects, what's the possibility that species can recolonize? And then the edge effects, again, which we'll talk about, how the patch itself, depending on its size, may be dominated by the sort of the external factors around the patch rather than the internal processes that are happening within the patch. So it's kind of the difference between those. And I'm not going to go through this. This is a diagram of kind of conceptual framework from John Weems back in the mid-1980s, which was really nice sort of kind of summary of the kinds of biological consequences that might happen across a variety of different scales, from looking at intrinsic characteristics of species themselves to kind of the spatial effects like the isolation effects, size effects, to the kinds of what's going on with the populations in the sense of, are the populations at some sort of equilibrium or not? How does it change the probability of extinction of populations, to the larger scale fragmentation effects? So it kind of set up the, a lot of the work that went on in that decade. John Weems, by the way, worked on birds, and many of these fragmentation studies have been done with birds because they're relatively easy to study compared to a lot of different organisms. So I want to move us to Manaus, or in the area around Manaus, because there's been a very famous study on the biological consequences of fragmentation that was first started by Tom Lovejoy, who did his PhD dissertation actually outside of Belém, working in the canopies of the forest outside of Belém, studying birds. And after getting his PhD, he moved on to the World Wildlife Fund, and he was very interested in sort of the consequences of fragmentation and the design of nature reserves. Because as I mentioned, a lot of the early theory really kind of generated a lot of discussion about how do you best design reserves. Do you have one big, large reserve, or do you have a variety of smaller reserves that may or may not be connected to each other? And that was called the SLOSS debate, S-L-O-S-S, single large or several small reserves. How many of you remember the SLOSS debate? Yeah. Well, it generated lots of controversy when I was a grad student. They would duke it out, it's which is better. So the idea about why several small reserves might be better is because of these chance events. That if you put all your eggs in one basket and you have a huge fire or a huge hurricane go through there, you could lose everything. And so some people thought that by having these several small reserves, or a disease epidemic, but if you have your populations kind of spread out, then if you lose one or two, you still have others that are left. And that was a really simplified debate. And again, as everything's a lot more complex than that. But that was really the big issue of the day when Tom Lovejoy, in about 1979, worked with the National Institutes of Amazon Research, INPA, which is based in Manaus, to say, well, why don't we do this experimentally? Let's, in this area that's really pretty much just forest outside here, 70 kilometers north of Manaus, and there is past cattle activity beginning to develop in the region. Why don't we create these isolated forest fragments and see if we can test some of these ideas that were being generated at the time. So in other words, these were kind of the driving questions that were being asked. What effect does fragment size have on the rate of species extinction? Would the local extinction rate eventually slow and halt, equalizing the number of species? Because remember in the island biogeography theory, they said it was a dynamic equilibrium, that at some point you get to some number and it pretty much stays there. Well, that's all pretty theoretical. We haven't really been able to test those ideas very well. And then how do species interactions and demography change as a result of reduced habitat? So this project sort of got off the ground in 1979, and forest clearing around these patches took place in the very early 1980s. And it was a lot of effort and a lot of money to essentially, you can see here's a forest patch, here's a forest patch. This is cattle pasture essentially all around it. This is a relatively early picture. And then they'd have control sites out here in the main block of forest that would be essentially marked off and be the same size as these fragments that were within the cattle pastures. So zooming in a little bit, this is a 1 hectare patch and a 10 hectare patch. 1 hectare is essentially 100 meters on a side, and a 10 hectare is about 320 or so meters on a side. So you can see that they kind of put them right in a box. So they didn't change the shape of it, which is important for respect to edge effects, but they kept them sort of rectangular in shape. And then they had a whole slew of people in there studying everything from, the carabid beetles to the birds to the trees to the fungi to everything. And so it's important to just kind of get our terms right here. These are obviously what we're calling the fragments. This is the continuous forest. So this would be the mainland in the sense of the island biogeography theory. And these are not very isolated fragments relative to many of the oceanic islands that these studies have been built on. And then this is the matrix, which for the most part, back in the 1980s, was ignored. It was viewed as being inhospitable ocean. Okay, we'll come back to that, obviously, in just a little bit. So the matrix was not considered important, at least in these early studies. So if we look at some of the biological consequences, so what are some of the species characteristics? And if we look at species characteristics that are related to this habitat loss component of fragmentation, you get species that have, large body size, high trophic position like jaguars, meaning they're predators. They're at the top of the food chain, exist in low population densities or low abundance. Well, these are the species that are susceptible to habitat loss and are usually the first ones that you lose. So for example, this is work that's been done in French Guiana. These are some of our top predators with respect to the bird population. So the harpy eagles, or the crested eagle, Morphnus. The harpy eagle, by the way, how many of you have seen a harpy eagle? Impressive, no? They stand like this high. I mean, that's a big eagle. And it takes monkeys out of the trees or sloths or something like that. And if you're at the Baleen, if you ever go to the Baleen, I don't know, garden or zoo, I forget what it's called. Museo Geldi? Yeah, Museo Geldi. They've got this harpy eagle in this big cage, actually a pair of them. And that's the first harpy eagle I ever saw. And, you can't count it. It's in a cage. But I did see one on top of Jewish region. But you'd be standing way up there, and the little kids would go walking by, and monkey-sized little kids. I mean, there are stories actually of harpy eagles, making paths at young children as well in forested areas. But anyways, the point being is they have home range sizes. This is a 10,000 hectare plot. What we were just looking at was a 1 hectare and 100 hectare, where you can see sort of, this is the crested eagles, you can see their home range size for a pair is much, much larger than either of those 1 hectare or 100 hectares. So you obviously can't maintain populations of these if you have really small forest fragments unless they can use that matrix. So I put this up here because it is such an important component of the paradigm in conservation biology that small populations are particularly susceptible to extinction. And they're susceptible to extinction because of these stochastic or chance factors. And chance factors can be divided up generally into kind of 4 different categories. One is demographic stochasticity. So that's operating at the level of the individual. So let's say you do have a forest that got cut down and all you have is 1 hectare patch left, and you've got 10 individuals of that particular species in there. Well, just by chance, they might be all 10 males and no females. That's like demographic stochasticity, okay? Environmental stochasticity are like these weather patterns, you know, big rain, drought year, things like that, that may affect populations. So they don't necessarily affect individuals, but they affect the whole population, and usually across species as well. Catastrophes, well, we all know what catastrophes are. And then there's genetic stochasticity. So like inbreeding. So again, you're down to 10 individuals in the fragment, and they're all your sisters and brothers. You know, they're all closely related. And there's often this consequence of mating with a close relative. You know, it may reduce your fitness. You know, your own fitness. There may be genetic defects, things like that. So the genetic stochasticity is also one of those things. All of these things may operate together and interact with each other to affect small populations, which make them at greater risk to extinction. And so when we think about other characteristics that are related to habitat loss, I mentioned before that, you know, the top predators, which often exist at low population sizes, like the harpy eagle, like the jaguar, but there's also these specialists that if, you know, in smaller fragments, they're much less likely to have the resources that they depend on to be able to maintain population sizes. So specialists are like these dung beetles and carrion beetles. So this is a study that came from the biological dynamics of fragmented forests. And so this is a species rank. So if you go along here, it just means there's more and more species. And then this is the abundance. So when you look at the kind of the clear cut, which is this one here, versus the 1 hectare, which is this one here, clear cut obviously has many fewer species than the 1 hectare. The 1 hectare has fewer species than the 10 hectare, which has fewer species than the continuous forest. And so you get a loss of species, but also what you're really losing are these specialist species in particular. And so that has its consequences. And I think one of the articles talked about in forest fragments, you have less decomposers. And these are sort of a decomposer in essence of dealing with the dung and transferring the resources from the dung of animals to essentially to the soil. Well, you know, you begin to lose these species. It begins to affect the ecological processes of decomposition that occur within the forest. So there's kind of these secondary effects of loss. Army ants, does everybody know what army ants are? So army ants are, you know, this social kinds of ants that move together, live together, occur in colony sizes of 1 million or more. And as they move through the forest like an army, you can hear them coming from tens of meters away. They're flushing out the lizards and the insects and everything in front of them. And then there's a whole suite of animals that aren't eating on the ants themselves, but are eating on everything that's being flushed in front. The lizards, the insects, you know, whatever. And so there are a lot of, in birds and others, but there's a lot of what we call obligate army ant birds that just spend their life hanging out near these guys, and that's how they make their living, is by feeding on the insects that the army ants are flushing out. Well, in the fragmented forest sites, when you had a 1 hectare and a 10 hectare patch, you lost army ants because they actually need a much larger home range size than the birds do. And so they disappeared, and they might have disappeared just by chance alone. When you cut it, they weren't there. They were what they call a bivouac, which is when they all are together. They weren't there, and then they weren't able to recolonize back into those fragments, or they were there, but they just couldn't persist there. So what happens is the birds that are associated with them will also disappear from the sites without their key resources.
I'm just wondering if
Or are they always? They have a stationary phase and they have a kind of a moving phase. And they're in their stationary phase when they, so they have pupa, they have eggs and pupa, so the larvae pupate, and then they emerge as sort of the adult animal. And so when they have pupa, they're usually stationary. And they'll go out and forage and come back, go out and forage and come back. And then when, is that right? And then when they have, no, it's maybe when they have larvae, they're stationary and they have to come back and feed the larva. The pupa, they can actually move. So they have different, what they call nomadic and stationary phases, but they're generally going out in swarms every day to feed. No, it's one colony that's all together, and I don't know if there are multiple queens or not in that colony. I'll tell you a funny story. I mean, when these guys did disappear, I can't remember when my next slide is. When they did disappear from the 1 hectare and 10 hectare fragments, there was a graduate student at LSU that, God bless him, he took a 55-gallon garbage can, went out to a continuous forest site, found the queen, put the queen in there, and then all the army ants moved into the gallon drum. And then he closed it up, taped it, put it on his back, and hiked it out to the 1 hectare and the 10 hectare fragment to see if the birds had come back. Could you imagine doing that for your PhD dissertation? And then I assume he replicated it. I don't remember. But he made it out there without it opening up. What happened, I don't remember. We do have, I don't think the birds actually didn't move back until a little bit later in the story, which you'll see in just a little bit.
Very good story arc.
Yeah. And then there are species characteristics which are related to isolation, and what's your ability to disperse across that ocean, essentially? Can you disperse across? Can you, even if you have a small population here, if you've got movement in between, then you're essentially one big population. And this all led into a whole other development of theory called metapopulation theory, which I'm not going to get into in this lecture, but it is related to sort of dispersal and how connected are populations in these different sorts of patches. So your ability to disperse, your ability to use a variety of different habitats will help you persist in a landscape that's something like this with isolated fragments. And then there's also this sort of the effects having to the environmental consequences of fragmentation is how do you average out the effects over a wider area? So you might have these resource hotspots eliminated, like the pig wallows or the army ants or something like that. And then you get the alteration, the context and configuration of the remaining habitat, which we often think is edge effects, but the alterations in competition, in the cross-boundary subsidies. In other words, moving across habitats to be able to, let's say in the dry season you're here, in the wet season you're here, taking advantage of different kinds of resources and making your life, averaging out the effects by being able to feed in different areas. The nest predation effects, there's all kinds of studies that nest predators are more susceptible on edges or in smaller fragments than they are. The secondary extinction, unidirectional filter, edge creep, and so forth. Let me just talk about a couple of these. So the jaguar, or you hear unidirectional filter being talked often about jaguars, you hear it being talked about elephants. So the minute a jaguar walks out of that forest into that cattle pasture, they're much more susceptible. They may get, hunted out or shot because they're going after cattle. Just like when the elephant, kind of walks into that cropland area, it's maybe just a unidirectional filter. They may walk out and never be able to walk in. That's sort of the idea of the unidirectional filter. Greater risk involved. When you lose top predators like jaguars, you actually then have a release in populations like Maslow, the Claudimundi. Those are great nest predators. So their populations go up, and so there's that secondary effect on nests that will happen with Claudimundis. These guys tend to go up as well. They feed on seeds, they disperse seeds. So that sort of changes the regeneration dynamics of plants in either positive or negative ways. These guys you may lose Or if you can maintain them, they may increase in abundance because you don't have the big predator that's feeding on them and things like that. We already sort of talked about the dung beetle. So the environmental conditions of fragments also change. They become hotter, they become drier, as you read about in the readings. The soil moisture is lower, as you read about, which makes them more susceptible to fire, and the light levels are higher. Well, light levels being higher may actually be a positive thing for some organisms, like some of the butterflies, actually like increased light and are more active. And so why are these edge effects happening, or what kinds of edge effects do we have? We have abiotic effects, where there's changes in the environmental conditions that result from just being nearby very different kinds of habitats, being right next to pastures. The direct biological effects, where you may get desiccation of wind and so forth. The indirect effects, which is when you lose the top predator, how does that impact your predation rate, your competition with other like species, seed dispersal, which is really important for tropical trees. 80% or more of tropical trees depend on animals to disperse their seeds, or pollination and so forth. And Carolina Murcia, who was a graduate student here at the University of Florida and then went on to work for Wildlife Conservation Society for a number of years, she had one of really important papers on edge effects from sort of a theoretical standpoint. There have been a lot of literature on edge effects, a lot of pattern-generated papers, but not a lot of people thinking about what are the underlying processes. And I like this figure because sometimes ecology is messy, it's complex, and you don't really understand the underlying things. Well, in the top is the classical edge effect response, where as you move into the interior of a forest, you may have some conditions change up to a certain point, and that's where you say the edge effect is. It goes in 100 meters, or it goes in 500 meters into the forest. And then after that, everything's back to sort of normal. Well, that's kind of the simplest case. Whereas in fact, what often happens is you get some sort of bimodal effect of edge effect. So we might here be talking about tree mortality, or we might be talking about soil desiccation, or whatever. Just think of the kinds of factors. Well, it may be a bimodal effect, which is a little bit harder. We always think things are going to be linear, but often they're not linear. They're more complex patterns. Or it may be that they're actually, you're measuring something Y, but Y is being affected by two different things that have absolutely opposite effects to the edge, which when you measure Y, you look like there's no edge effect. Where in reality, there is edge effects, but it's more complex than what you think about. So edge effects can be actually difficult to measure. But one of the edge effects we do know is really important and going on, at least in this biological dynamics and many other places throughout the Amazon and elsewhere, is that by cutting the forest, you are changing how the forest is open to wind. And this is kind of how wind, if it was just a regular forest, the wind would pretty much be going over through the canopy. So if you're down in the understory of the forest, you don't feel it windy at all. If you climb the tree and you're doing observations up at the top of the tree, whoa, you're going like this, because there's a lot of wind up in the canopy that you just don't feel in the understory. But because it's been cut, the wind is coming into the forest, it's drying the edge of the forest, it's drying the leaf litter, and so forth. So wind conditions are one of these really, classical kinds of edge effects that you get. So this is a 10-hectare fragment in the Biological Dynamics of Fragment Forest project, which, by the way, I don't know if I said this, it moved, when Tom Lovejoy moved to Smithsonian Institution, he took the project with him. And it's now a collaboration between Smithsonian Institution and INPA, the National Institute of Amazonian Research, and it's still ongoing today. But when they first cut this 10-hectare fragment, the winds are coming from this end, and you can see that this is representing tree mortality or tree damage. And so all of that's happening on the prevailing wind side of the fragment. And this is right, a little bit after isolation. This is looking at the interior of the forest and not the exterior. This is right when it was isolated. This is a year later. So this is also a 10-hectare fragment. So there is much greater mortality and damage way inside that forest. It's a small fragment. So the winds are, you know, essentially coming in and causing damage. And then as you cause damage along on the inside, then you're also creating more openings. The wind can whip down in those openings and affect other areas throughout. And so when you look at the mortality and damage in the smaller fragments and near the edges, this is the distance to the edge, so this is more interior. This is the fragment area from 1 to 10 to 100, so the continuous forest. Well, you can see as you're closer to the edge or in smaller fragments, you have much more damage to trees. Well, that, you know, obviously has implications if you're a landowner and some of your capital value is in those patches, and you really hope to harvest those trees at some point to add to your livelihood. Well, if you have, you know, 1 hectare patch, then maybe some of these trees you really want to harvest are going to be damaged and won't be as valuable later on when you really need that patch at some point. So the edge effects, this is just a bunch of these that happen in the fragmented forest. They can be all kinds of different things, like soil moisture content goes maybe to about 25 meters into the forest. The, I don't know what the difference between soil moisture content and soil moisture, but there's another one that goes in about 100 meters. Relative humidity goes in about 100 meters. So you get different kinds of edge effects depending on the particular variable you might measure, at least in this study site. And so let's go back to some of the organisms. So some things like butterflies, not all butterflies, but a lot of butterflies are really kind of more likely to be found in clearings and on edges and things like that. And this is the number of butterfly species in different fragment size of 1 hectare and 10 hectare right before it was isolated, 2 weeks after essentially it got isolated, 1 year later and 2 years later. And actually this is kind of the opposite response of what you might expect. There are actually more butterfly species in these fragmented patches than less. This is one of the antbird species, and this is control fragments of 1 hectare, 10 hectare, and 100 hectare. Control meaning they're 1 hectare, but they're in continuous forest. And this is 1 hectare in cattle pasture. Okay, well, this just shows your kind of your classic area effect, that you have more terrestrial insectivores. This is an example of a terrestrial insectivore. They feed on insects that are on the ground, and you get more of them in bigger fragments. But, you know, we talked about earlier, are fragments really islands? And this is where we come back to the ants eventually. Well, they're not really true islands. And in fact, the matrix around that can regenerate. And in the case of the biological dynamics of fragmented forests, it's expensive to keep this down in cattle pasture. And in fact, they didn't have, I don't really quite know the story. Not all of the people that were there initially, landowners that might have been around it, you know, were willing to spend the money to keep that area open around the fragments. And at some point, they essentially could not maintain it in cattle pasture. And they started to grow up around some of these fragments, which actually ended up being another kind of interesting experiment. In some cases, you have, if the fragment was not, didn't burn prior, then it turns out that this tree, many of you probably know, Cecropia, grew up to become a monoculture essentially around these fragments. If there was burning, then this Vismia ended up growing up to be a monoculture. And they both had, you know, seeds that are widely dispersed by animals, and that was just sitting in the soil seed bank, you know, waiting for a chance to be able to grow up with no further burning. And so the way Vismia grows and the way Cecropia grows is really quite different tree geometry than certainly what you get in a cattle pasture. So the structure of the matrix was very different between a Cecropia and a Vismia-dominated matrix around these fragments. And that matrix is actually also really important in deciding sort of what are the impacts going to be in forest fragments. This is just, I put this up because it's work that was done by Emilio Bruna, and looking at seed germination in these different kinds of matrices, whether they're exposed to seed predators or not, the big point is that seed germination is higher in a Bismuth matrix of this particular species than it is in a Cecropia matrix. And the story could be completely different if we picked a different plant species. If we look at some of the obligate flock feeding birds, that means they kind of different individuals of different species get together and move together through the forest for different reasons. If we look at, again, we have a Cecropia dominated versus a Bismuth dominated, and we're not looking in this case at the matrix now, we're looking back at the fragment. And so it gets isolated, you lose species, but then when the matrix starts to regrow, at least in the 10-hectare fragments, these guys begin to move through that matrix and can recolonize fragments that are in a Cecropia-dominated matrix, but cannot recolonize in fragments that are surrounded by a Bismuth-dominated matrix. So the matrix influences what's happening inside the fragment. So think about agroforestry, which is a much more friendly matrix to move through than cattle pasture. So, you know, that there are the consequences then of the matrix. These are the ant followers, and ant followers, once you have that Cecropia, the obligate ant specialist, once you have that Cecropia-dominated matrix, again, it's also more friendly to the obligate ant followers, and they can move back in, assuming that there's army ants in those fragments. That will be the resource that they rely on. So that's like one of the sexiest birds on the planet and one of the most abundant birds in the Manaus area. But there's others like these in terrestrial insectivores that, regardless of the matrix, are not able to move back in. And these are relatively small fragments. What we think is going on here is that these guys are feeding, again, on the ground, on the leaf litter, and that leaf litter has dried out. The number of insect resources are probably much lower because insects love the humidity underneath leaves and all this other stuff. So it's probably a secondary effect of the edges. And maybe with more time, you know, they might be able to come back in. We don't know. Those studies are still ongoing. So forest fragments are really not oceanic islands, but we should think of them as existing in some sort of production landscape, whether it be cattle, agroforestry, timber plantation, and so forth. So why does it really matter, you know, whether, you know, about the size of the patches and how far they're isolated? I apologize for how this kind of got all fuzzy, but here's my point, is it might matter in your production landscape. Having that forest nearby, you get the ecological services of those native species. And this is one example of it. You have a coffee plantation out there. You've got some coffee plants that are close to the edge. You have some coffee plants that are far from the edge. Coffee plants close to the edge, they have flowers that are pollinated by a variety of different bees. They have many more bee visitors than those that are far from a forest edge. So the natural pollination services that you could have in your agricultural landscape may be affected by this pattern of forest fragmentation, or where your native forests are on your land. When the biological dynamics of fragmented forests project got going in 1979, it was actually at that point called the minimal critical size of ecosystems area. How, you know, small can an area be that could maintain populations of X, Y, and Z species, or maintain ecological or ecosystem processes? How small can you get, in essence, was driving a lot of the questions back then. And then they changed the name, I don't know, about 10 years into the project. So that's the MCSE plot, the minimal critical size of ecosystem area plot. There's a 1 hectare, a 10 hectare, 100 hectare, and so forth. And these are some kind of the larger mammals that you might expect in these areas. It's saying basically that if you wanted to maintain, let's not pick an armadillo, if you wanted to maintain a woolly monkey, you'd have to be at least 100 square kilometers in size to maintain a woolly monkey, a population of woolly monkeys, and so forth. So this is studies actually that had been done by John Robinson, who used to be here at the University of Florida and is now at Wildlife Conservation Society. So, you know, if we want jaguars, then we're going to need to have at least 10,000 square kilometer size areas to maintain a viable population of jaguars. And then, of course, when you have these forest fragment patches, as we've seen in some of the readings today, well, then there's roads often that are leading to them. There's changes in the dynamics. There's could be potentially hunting as well, and there's, of course, indigenous communities rely on subsistence hunting in many cases. But if you look at sort of the patterns of hunting as a function of the population density of organisms, whether the patches are isolated, continuous, or adjacent to continuous forests, or continuous forests, the population density of species that are not hunted generally stays about the same. There's some of them that decline in isolated forest patches that are susceptible, depending on their size. Species that are lightly hunted, have a decline in population density, but the ones that are particularly hit are the ones that are heavily hunted. They're not only susceptible to hunting in these isolated patches, but they're also susceptible to the size of the patches themselves. And so John Robinson kind of put our big group of mammals onto this table, and you can look at it later if you want, but these are the ones right in here that are sort of susceptible to targets of hunting, basically, whereas the ones in kind of the gray patch are susceptible to fragmentation as well. So there's some that are susceptible to both, according to Robinson, like tapirs and peccaries and rocket deer, which are all very good to eat. So those in particular would be affected. So with that, ending us here, I'm going to leave you just with some questions to kind of consider with respect to the biological consequences of fragmentation, as well as which species might do well in these fragmented landscapes, because fragmented landscapes are where we're at, right? There are a lot of fragmented landscapes up there, and there's a lot of new programs and with conservation groups, like the Living Landscapes program of Wildlife Conservation Society, which is how, given the landscapes that we have today, how do we basically make them, maintain the sort of natural ecosystem processes and populations of animals and plants and game species and all this other stuff. How do we better maintain those living landscapes? And so it's not only do you have this ocean next to a fragment, but you really have like a very viable production landscape next to a fragment. Think about it more holistically. It's essentially what the Living Landscape program is about with Wildlife Conservation Society. You might think about how these changes influence species interactions, some of the important interactions like pollination and seed dispersal, which can impact the production landscape, how they change ecosystem processes, isolation area effects, but then also, again, thinking about these production landscapes as well. And when does having a patch of native forest useful or not next to a production landscape? In what ways might it benefit a production landscape? So are those benefits greater than if you cut it down and put in more production? For example, what are the sorts of the trade-offs? So you might think about that. Done. Yes.